Once upon a time, there were no chickens in my garden. In fact, there wasn't even a garden. Not a flower, not a vegetable, not a tree, and no birdsong. And I dreamed of a garden with native trees that I could walk through and that would be home to the native birds. So we planted the trees, and when they grew, the birds came. First the silver eyes, then the little fantails chasing the bugs, then the tuis finally, once the co-eyes and flaxes started to bloom. And finally I got chickens in my garden. And then the sparrows came. I wondered what to do about the sparrows. They're not native to New Zealand, they don't belong here, and we had hundreds of them. And they were eating a lot of chicken food. Finally I realised the native birds came when I provided them with food, the berries and the nectar and the flaxes. The sparrows came when I provided them with a free buffet of chicken pellets. If I didn't want the sparrows, I had to stop feeding them. We had covered the whole run with chicken wire to keep the sparrows out, but they still squeezed through the holes. And when I opened the door to let the chickens out, the sparrows came flying in their hundreds to eat the chicken food. So we got a chicken feeder that would feed the chickens and not the sparrows. You've seen it in my videos. It's a grandpa's feeder. The chickens step on this platform in front of the feeder and the lid opens to allow access to the feed. And when the chickens step off the feeder, the lid closes completely. There's no way sparrows can get into that feed once the lid is closed. So there are lots of automatic feeders around on the market or even homemade. Why do I think this one is so good? Well, for a start, there's a basic idea. Feed the chickens, but make sure the feed is not available to any of the sparrows, mice, snakes, whatever kind of vermin you might have in your area. Once this lid is closed, there is no way that a mouse or a sparrow or anything larger than a cockroach can get into there. It's perfectly balanced so that the weight of a chicken will open the feeder, but anything much lighter than a chicken can't actually make it work. The one thing about this design that I really like is that you fill it from the top, while the chickens feed from the bottom. That means that as you add fresh food to the top, it pushes the old food through so that there's never any stale food left at the bottom of the feeder while you're putting fresh food on top. There are alternative feeders that just fill from the same place that the chickens eat, and I don't think that's anywhere near such a good idea. It has these little walls on the side. That's to make sure that the chicken has to approach from the front and step squarely on the foot plate to feed. Otherwise, there would be risk if one chicken was already standing and feeding of a second chicken coming in from the side to feed. Then when the first chicken stepped off, there could be unfortunate consequences for the second chicken. So these walls, I think, are a good idea. It's made of steel, so it's completely waterproof. Even outside like this environment in the very rainy Manawatu, we get a lot of rain here, and this feeder has been outside for years. No sign of rust that I can see. This is actually my original feeder, so it's over 10 years old. You can see there's a little bit of rust in this channel here, but certainly it's just surface rust and nothing that will affect the functioning of this feeder for many years to come. They hold a lot of food. That means that we don't need to be here morning and night to feed the chickens. Actually, when I'm home, I really like coming out in the morning and checking on the chickens, making sure all is well, and coming back again in the evening to collect the eggs and make sure they're all tucked in for the night. But it does mean that we can go away for a few days, secure in the knowledge that while we're away, the chickens have free access to plenty of food. So how do you teach your chickens how to use one of these grandpa's feeders? Well, it comes with some training instructions and a couple of extra nuts and bolts. The instructions are written under the lid so you can never forget them. The extra bolts are to hold the lid open while the chickens are learning. When you have the bolt in the highest position, the lid stays open all the time and doesn't move at all. Now this is the first stage at which you just get the chickens used to the idea that this is where they get their food. Step 2 is the cunning plan. The bolt is in the second position, and now when the chicken steps on the foot plate, the lid opens a little bit. When she steps off again, the lid closes but not all the way. So she can see that there is food in here, she can learn to approach it and get used to the idea that when she steps on the foot plate, the lid will move in front of her eyes. That can be a little startling at first, but they soon get the idea. None of my chickens have ever had any problem learning how to get access to these food. The instructions say not to use it with baby chicks, but actually I start training my baby chicks with it before they're big enough to go outside by keeping it in the locked open position like this. That way they get used to the idea that this is where their food is. As soon as the chicks are heavy enough to actually make the mechanism work, I start training them on the step 2. So by the time they need to go outside, they're already almost trained in how to use the grandpa's feeder properly. So the sparrows never get a chance. As I say, I have more than one of them. That's because I like to hatch chicks. And that means I have chickens of different generations that need to be kept separate. And I like to have a feeder for each of them so that the sparrows don't multiply again. When it came to buying a second one, I was tempted by a cheaper alternative. And in fact, I got my husband to try and make one. But apart from the fact that it's a really tricky design, there was also the problem that it didn't last anywhere near as well in the bad weather, the rain being outside. So although you might be able to come up with something of a similar design with some of these features on your own, or maybe even find something like that I just don't think that anything is as good as the real grandpa's feeder, and that's why I now have 3 of them. And no, if it sounds like a bit of an advertisement for a grandpa's feeder, I'm not getting sponsored or paid to say any of this. I just like to share with you what I've found works really well for me.